Look at the walls around you right now. Drywall, insulation, maybe a furnace humming somewhere you never think about, keeping the temperature exactly where you set it and forgot about it. You didn't build any of it, and you'll never have to. But 20,000 years ago, on a treeless stretch of the Ukrainian steppe, a family faced a design problem you will never face in your life. Build a structure capable of keeping every person inside it alive through a winter that could hit minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, using nothing but stone tools, hide, and the bones of dead animals. No lumber yard, no insulation roll, no thermostat to argue with. Just a pile of bones, a handful of hands, and months of cold bearing down with no mercy built in. What they actually built doesn't just meet that problem, it humiliates it. And the way archaeologists found out is one of the strangest discoveries in the history of architecture. Here's what almost every documentary gets wrong first. Ice Age humans are always drawn the same way. A small fire, a huddled group, a cave mouth, just barely surviving until morning, shivering their way from one sunrise to the next. That image is comfortable. It requires nothing of you. It's also mostly false. The real evidence dug out of frozen ground over the last century shows something far closer to a construction crew than a huddled tribe waiting to die. Start small, because the sophistication builds fast. At sites scattered across the open steppe of Eastern Europe, archaeologists have found shallow, deliberately dug depressions cut into the earth before any wall ever went up. Tool marks along the edges rule out erosion or accident. That's a decision, made by someone standing on open ground, choosing to dig down before building up. And the reason is pure physics. Digging even a few feet below the surface puts you into ground that holds heat far longer than the air above it, insulated from wind entirely. Before a single wall existed, ancient builders had already figured out the first rule of insulation. Don't fight the cold from ground level. Get underneath it first. But the discovery that actually stopped archaeologists cold the first time they saw it came from two sites in Ukraine, Mezhirish and Kostenki. What researchers found, there wasn't a shelter, and it wasn't a windbreak. It was a house, an actual engineered building made almost entirely from the skeletons of woolly mammoths, standing on open ground with no trees for 50 miles in any direction. Picture the material list, because every piece of it was chosen on purpose. Mammoth skulls, some weighing more than 300 pounds apiece, arranged in a ring and used as load-bearing foundation blocks, the way you'd pour a concrete footing today. Long curved tusks, interlocked overhead into a domed framework strong enough to hold its own weight against wind and snow load without a single support beam. Smaller limb bones packed into every remaining gap, adding rigidity exactly where the frame needed it most and nowhere else. The entire structure wrapped in multiple stitched layers of mammoth hide, thick enough to block a steppe wind, cold enough to kill exposed skin in minutes, and angled precisely enough to shed snow instead of collecting it into a crushing weight overhead. This wasn't scavenged debris stacked into a wall because it was the only material lying around. Bones were selected by size, matched by structural function, and assembled the way a modern architect chooses beams, trusses, and load paths. And it worked far better than it has any right to. Experimental archaeologists who rebuilt these structures using period-accurate tools and methods measured the interior temperature against nothing more than a small, modest fire. The result? An interior 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, warmer than the air outside, sustained through a full Ice Age night. Modern emergency Arctic shelters built with industrial insulation, sealed synthetic membranes, and battery-powered heaters routinely perform no better than that number. Read that again. A structure built from bones, hide, and stone tools matched the thermal performance of equipment modern engineers design today with computer modeling, wind tunnel testing, and synthetic insulation that didn't exist until the last 100 years. None of it worked without fire. And fire inside a mammoth bone house was not a simple campfire you huddle around and hope for the best. It was infrastructure, laid out with the same intent as a floor plan. A central hearth handled the bulk of the heating output for the whole structure. Smaller secondary hearths were positioned around the interior, creating distinct warm zones for distinct jobs. One area for cooking, one for tool making and repair, and one kept deliberately warmest of all, closest to the fire, reserved for children and the elderly. That's not an accident of where people happened to sit down at the end of a long day. That's zoning, planned before anyone moved in. Fuel was its own engineering problem, and the answer wasn't obvious. On a steppe with almost no trees for hundreds of miles, ancient builders burned dried mammoth dung and processed bone instead of wood, and chemical residue analysis on hearth remains shows this fuel was deliberately prepared, not simply thrown onto a flame and left to burn however it wanted. It was treated and shaped to burn at a specific, manageable rate, the Ice Age equivalent of choosing the right grade of firewood. And because a sealed structure full of breathing people and burning fuel builds up moisture fast, builders added something you would not expect to find 20,000 years ago: ventilation, engineered directly into the bone framework. Small openings near ground level pulled in fresh, cold air. Larger gaps near the domed peak let warm, moisture-heavy air escape before it could freeze solid against the hide and rot the structure from the inside out. Modern Arctic shelters use the exact same principle today, just with plastic vents where these builders used gaps between mammoth ribs. Here's something almost no documentary about this topic ever mentions: what happened once the fire settled low and the day's work finally stopped. For most of human history, before electric light existed anywhere on Earth, people didn't sleep the way you do. In 1992, psychiatrist Thomas Weir removed a group of modern volunteers from all artificial light for a full month, just to see what would happen. Within weeks, every single one of them shifted, without being told to the same pattern. Roughly 4 hours of sleep, a quiet wakeful period of an hour or two in the middle of the night, then 4 more hours of sleep until dawn. That gap in the middle wasn't wasted, restless time. Anthropologists studying present-day, hunter-gatherer groups who still live largely without artificial light found that nighttime conversation around the fire is almost a completely different activity from daytime talk. Daytime conversation is overwhelmingly logistics: where to find food, who's doing which job, what needs repairing. Nighttime conversation, by a wide margin, is stories. Inside a mammoth bone house, deep in an Ice Age winter, with nowhere to go and months of forced closeness stretching out ahead, that quiet, firelit gap between sleep cycles was very likely where human storytelling as we still practice it took its current shape. Building one of these houses was never a weekend project, and it shows in how deliberately it had to be scheduled. Reconstructions suggest it took roughly 2 to 3 weeks of continuous coordinated labor from 8 to 10 adults working together, which means construction had to begin in late summer, well before the first hard frost made outdoor work impossible and the ground froze solid. Whoever ran that build was carrying a seasonal calendar in their head, a labor plan for 10 adults, and enough social coordination to keep everyone pulling in the same direction for weeks without the whole thing falling apart. And the house was never finished once it went up. Bone joints cracked under wind load, hide coverings tore and let cold air knife through the gap. Archaeological evidence shows constant patching, replacement, and rebuilding throughout the winter months, which means this was never a structure people built once and simply hoped would hold. It was a living system, actively managed and repaired day by day, for as long as the cold lasted, and not one day longer than necessary. When the Ice Age ended and forests spread back across land that used to be open steppe, this entire body of knowledge, the bone architecture, the hearth zoning, the engineered ventilation, simply stopped being necessary and faded out within a handful of generations. It sat unused and almost entirely unknown for roughly 15,000 years. Then, in the 20th century, modern engineers designing Arctic field shelters started running headfirst into the exact same physics problems ancient builders had already solved: heat retention, moisture control, wind-shedding roof geometry, structural load with minimal material. Several modern cold-weather shelter designs, including some used in military Arctic training programs today, were only developed after researchers studied these reconstructed Ice Age structures in detail, We didn't improve on the original solution. We spent roughly a century rediscovering it with wind tunnels and computer models, and arrived back at almost exactly the same answer bone and hide builders reached with nothing but patient observation and the plain necessity of not freezing to death. Look at your walls again. Somewhere in the design of your home, whether you've ever thought about it or not, is the same basic logic that kept an entire family alive inside a dome built from mammoth bone 20,000 years ago. Trap warm air close to the body, block the wind completely, and let moisture escape before it can freeze you from the inside out while you sleep. You have never once had to solve that problem yourself because it was already solved, brutally and completely, by people working with nothing but bone, hide, fire, and a flat refusal to freeze. The house you live in tonight didn't invent warmth. It inherited it, fully paid for, by builders who earned every single degree of it the hardest way there is.